What if your pain didn't mean God had forgotten you? What if your suffering was actually a sign of your strength, so strong that even heaven took notice? There's a man in the Bible whose story is so raw, so real, and so human that it echoes across every generation. He didn't lose just a job. He lost his whole world, but through it all, he didn't curse God. He questioned him. He cried out. He wrestled. And in the end, he came out with more than he had before because his faith was tested in fire. His name, Job. This is not just a story about loss. It's a story about trust, about endurance, and about what happens when God himself says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Let's begin. In a land far away from Jerusalem, outside the borders of Israel, there lived a man named Job. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even an Israelite, but heaven knew his name, and so did hell. Job chapter 1, verse 1 says, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil." Job was a man of integrity. He didn't play games with his faith. He didn't worship God just in public or just when things were going well. He was sincere, day in and day out. He respected God, avoided evil, and walked upright. And on top of that, he was blessed. The Bible tells us Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. He also had many servants and a reputation that stretched across the region. The Bible says he was the greatest of all the people of the East. That's in Job chapter 1, verse 3. But Job wasn't just wealthy. He was deeply spiritual. Every time his children held feasts or celebrations, Job would rise early the next morning and offer burnt sacrifices on their behalf. He thought, what if one of them sinned in their heart and didn't say anything out loud? That's the kind of man Job was, so connected to God that he covered his family in prayer constantly. But then, something happened behind the scenes. In Job chapter 1, verse 6, the Bible describes a day when the angels, called the sons of God, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan showed up too. God asked Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth in it. Then God said something extraordinary in verse 8. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Imagine that. God was bragging about Job, but Satan wasn't impressed. He said, of course Job fears you. You've put a hedge around him. You've blessed everything he has, but stretch out your hand and strike what he owns, and he'll curse you to your face. And God, knowing Job's heart, allowed the test. In a single day, everything fell apart. A servant came running. The Sabaeans attacked and stole your oxen and donkeys. Another came. Fire fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants. A third arrived. The Chaldeans raided and took your camels. And finally, the worst news of all. A wind struck the house where your sons and daughters were feasting, and it collapsed. They are all dead. One loss after another, wave after wave. And what did Job do? In Job chapter 1, verse 20, it says, Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground in worship. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He didn't fake a smile. He didn't hide his pain, but even in grief, Job still honored God. Job had just experienced the worst day imaginable. His livestock, his servants, his wealth, and most heartbreakingly, his children were all taken from him in a matter of hours. Any normal person would collapse under that kind of pressure, and Job did fall, but not in defeat. He fell in worship. Job chapter 1, verse 22 says, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't pretend to like it, but he didn't curse God. He stayed faithful, but the test wasn't over yet. In Job chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, the scene shifts again to a heavenly meeting. The angels gathered before God, and once again, Satan came with them. And God asked the same question, where have you come from? Satan replied, from going to and fro on the earth. Then God pointed back to Job and said, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still holds fast to his integrity, even though you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." That's in Job chapter 2, verse 3. Satan fired back. "Skin for skin," he said. "A man will give anything to save his own life, but strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." So once again, God allowed the test, but this time it got personal. Satan left God's presence and struck Job with painful boils from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. That's in Job chapter 2, verse 7. Job was in so much agony, he sat in ashes and scraped his skin with a piece of broken pottery. His body was hurting, but even worse was the silence from heaven. There was no explanation, no word from God, just pain. And then came the voice of the one person who should have comforted him, his wife. Job chapter 2, verse 9 says, his wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." Her words weren't just bitter, they were hopeless. She had seen the suffering and she had no answers. She assumed God had abandoned them, but Job replied in verse 10, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" And again, the Bible makes it clear, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now Job was physically wrecked, emotionally drained, and sitting alone in silence. But three of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, came from far away when they heard what had happened. When they saw him, they didn't even recognize him. His suffering was that severe. Job chapter 2, verse 13 says, "They sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. They wept, they tore their robes, they just sat in silence." Sometimes grief is too big for words, and Job was living through the kind of pain most people couldn't imagine. He was struck, he was broken, but somehow he was still standing. For 7 days, Job's friends sat with him in silence. They didn't speak, they didn't offer advice. They just sat beside him while he grieved. At first, that silence was comforting, just knowing someone was there. But on the 7th day, Job finally broke the silence. In Job chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth." He didn't curse God, he cursed the day he was born. He said things like, "May the day of my birth perish, and why did I not perish at birth?" Job wasn't trying to be dramatic. He was heartbroken. He didn't understand why someone who had served God faithfully was now suffering so deeply. And that's when his friends started talking, and everything got worse. His first friend Eliphaz spoke up. At first he tried to sound gentle. In Job chapter 4, verse 7, Eliphaz said, "Consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed?" In other words, at Job, good people don't suffer like this. You must have done something wrong. That theme continued with the next two friends, Bildad and Zophar. They all believed the same thing. If Job was suffering, it must be punishment from God for some hidden sin. But Job knew he hadn't done anything to deserve this, and that made his suffering even heavier, because now even his closest friends were blaming him. Over the next many chapters, Job went back and forth with them. They said, "Repent, and God will restore you." Job said, "I haven't sinned like you think I have." Job wasn't claiming to be perfect, but he knew he hadn't done anything to deserve the kind of punishment he was enduring. He cried out in Job chapter 6, verse 10, "At least I can take comfort in this, that I have not denied the words of the Holy One." That's the heart of Job's pain, not just the boils or the loss of family or the ruined wealth. His greatest wound was not knowing why. He believed God was just, but his life felt like evidence to the contrary. And his friends, who should have supported him, were convinced he had brought this on himself. Have you ever been in a place like that, where life breaks you down, and instead of people helping you up, they question your faith? They assume your suffering is because you're doing something wrong. They don't know the full story, but they speak like they do. That's where Job was. But through all of this, Job kept doing one thing. He kept talking to God. Even when he was angry, even when he was confused, even when he felt abandoned, he never shut God out. In Job chapter 13, verse 15, he says something powerful. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." That's the cry of a broken heart holding onto faith by a thread. Job didn't get answers, but he stayed in the conversation. And sometimes that's what real faith looks like. Not perfect words, but persistent trust. Job had said everything he could say. He had poured out his heart. He had defended himself, challenged his friends, and begged God for an explanation. Day after day, pain had been his companion. Night after night, he had waited in silence. And then, finally, God spoke. In Job chapter 38, verse 1, it says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said," God didn't come gently in a whisper or softly in the breeze. He came in a storm, a whirlwind, a visible, violent reminder of his power and majesty. But this wasn't punishment. It was a response. God hadn't forgotten Job. He was ready to reveal himself. And instead of giving Job explanations, God asked questions. In Job chapter 38, verse 4, God asked, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." God didn't just ask Job one question. He asked over 70. He asked, "Have you ever commanded the morning to appear? Who shuts up the sea behind doors when it bursts from the womb? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way?" One by one, God unfolded the mysteries of creation, the earth, the seas, the skies, the animals. From mountain goats giving birth to eagles soaring in the sky, God showed Job that his wisdom stretches beyond what human minds can grasp. God wasn't angry. He was correcting Job's limited view. You see, Job had tried to make sense of his suffering through human logic. He assumed God had to explain himself, but God revealed something far deeper, that his ways are higher than ours. He is not only creator, he is sustainer, the one who keeps everything in balance, even when it feels like your world is falling apart. And in that moment, Job was humbled, not humiliated, humbled in awe. In Job chapter 40, verse 3, Job replied, "Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth." He realized that while he had every right to feel his pain, he didn't have the full picture. God hadn't stopped being just. He hadn't stopped being good. He had simply been working on a level Job couldn't yet see. Then in Job chapter 42, verse 5, Job said something beautiful. "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." All his life, Job had believed in God, but now he had encountered God. His pain had opened the door for deeper revelation. And here's what's amazing. God never told Job about the conversation in heaven. He didn't reveal that Satan had challenged him or that this was all a test. He didn't explain the why, because Job didn't need a reason. He needed a revelation. And in the middle of the storm, he got it. Job had walked through suffering, but now he saw the face of his Savior in the storm. Job had been through it all. He lost his wealth. He lost his children. He lost his health. He lost the support of his friends. And for a time, he even felt like he lost God's voice. But now, after all the pain and all the questioning, something incredible happens. In Job chapter 42, verse 7, God turns his attention, not to Job, but to Job's friends. He says to Eliphaz the Temanite, "I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has." God had listened to all their speeches, the blame, the false accusations, the lectures, and he was not impressed. Job's friends thought they were defending God, but in reality, they misrepresented him. God tells them to bring a burnt offering and to ask Job to pray for them. Think about that. The same man they judged, they now had to ask for prayer. And Job, being the faithful man he always was, forgave them and interceded for them. Then comes the moment of restoration. Job chapter 42, verse 10 says, "And the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Double. Job had lost everything, but God didn't just give it back. He gave more. He received twice the number of livestock, 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had more children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. The Bible even names the daughters, Jemimah, Keziah, and Karen Hapush, and says they were the most beautiful women in the land. This is important. Job wasn't just blessed materially, he was restored emotionally. He held children in his arms again. He saw life return to his home. He laughed again. He healed. Job chapter 42 verse 16 says, "After this Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation." Job got to experience joy again. He didn't just survive, he lived. But the most powerful part of Job's restoration isn't just the animals or the riches, it's the relationship. Job had always known about God. He had always feared him, worshiped him, prayed to him. But now he had walked through fire and came out with a deeper understanding of who God really is. In Job chapter 42, verse 5, Job said, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. That's what the story is really about. Not just what Job lost, not just what Job got back, but who Job became through it all. A man whose faith didn't break under pressure. A man who kept speaking to God, even when it felt like God had gone silent. A man who learned that sometimes the greatest revelation comes through the deepest suffering. Job's story teaches us that God doesn't always explain, but he does restore. And when he restores, it's not just about giving things back. It's about making us new. You may feel like you're in your own chapter of loss. Maybe you've questioned, cried, and sat in silence like Job. But hold on, God is not finished. If you're still breathing, you're still in the story. The same God who restored Job still restores today. If Job's story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit subscribe for more powerful Bible stories that remind us of who God is, even in our darkest moments. Drop a comment below. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. If you're holding on to faith like Job did, and share this with someone going through a storm, they need to know that restoration is coming, because your pain has a purpose, and your story, like Job's, isn't over yet.
Shalom, brothers and sisters. Did you know we have an online store? It's called theroyalremnant.com. We have a variety of clothing and home decor items. Explore our sweatshirts. We have a few different designs and multiple color options. Or navigate to our home decor section and check out our candle designs. We have candles that read Shalom and some that read All Praises to the Most High. If you don't see something you love at the moment, sign up for our email list to learn of new items. Grab your free Bible story coloring pages, and your email will be added to our list. Thank you for your support. It encourages us to keep making content and merchandise to boldly share our faith. Shalom.